In this panel, we actually wanted to talk a little bit about how Maui can actually drive ESG investment, how the unique aspects of Maui can actually help do that, and how Maui can basically serve as a catalyst and a model for both attract investment that we need that has ESG standards, Ahupua standards, but also use the global model. Before we do that, I wanted to actually ask the panel to introduce themselves. So let's actually start. Yeah. That's okay.
Don't forget me. Aloha. Aloha. I'm Mahina Martin for Hawaiian Electric. I handle and I oversee public affairs for the island of Maui, Molokai, and Lanai. We're very happy to be here. I wear different hats. Some of you, you've been part of our challenges and journeys to reach 100% renewable for Hawaii by 2045 through community engagement and involvement. So it's quite a process. But also, I really enjoy the relationships we have as a community because I see many of you in the room from our community groups. We fought in the Public Land Development Corps years ago to conserve our public lands in Hawaii and neighbor islands. We've been together on different things, rallying for the Puna lava disaster. We stood together and walked together, and we recently did our Kapu Aloha Unity March. So I'm here today because I think I wear a bunch of different hats, not just from the business sector, but from the nonprofit sector and as part of an involved community person. So I'm really, really interested in today because a lot of you have come to me and said, what the heck? They want to give us money? Or? So we're all here together to find out how we can do it together. Aloha.
Thank you, Jen.
I'm very intimidated by the way that you have to enunciate words. So Ben Prochazka, aloha, by the way, I guess. So Ben Prochazka with the Electrification Coalition. For background, we're a nonprofit organization that is based in DC. I work from home in North Carolina, though, so I've traveled a pretty far distance to be here. But we basically, throughout the organizational history, we're working to accelerate the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles. And so we're part technical experts. And that shows up with, we work on a program called the American Cities Climate Challenge on behalf of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and we work with around 25 cities across the country, including Honolulu, to help them as they're sort of thinking about pathways for faster electrification. We're also focused a lot on direct implementation programs. So we actually created one of the nation's first EV rental car programs in Orlando called Drive Electric Orlando. And so part of the reason I'm here. But those sort of implementation efforts are always designed around the hope that those can scale. And sort of a better example of that is that with a program called Fleets for the Future, it was working on reducing the soft costs of vehicle acquisition for public agencies. And there's lots of challenges there, right? So if Honolulu wants to go 100% for their EV fleet, how do they do that given current budget constraints, given the fact that they are a non-taxed entity, so they're not eligible for federal tax credits or other mechanisms that consumers might be able to access, or businesses. And so we work on creating sort of new models that can help sort of solve those problems, including then that extending a bit further and going into and turning into something called the Climate Bears EV Purchasing Collaborative, which is doing that now at scale. And we're actually helping the Canadian central government try to figure out how to do the same thing, given they have some different procurement processes. And then we also engage a lot in the policy space. And so obviously, as you sort of talk about those different implementation efforts and programmatic efforts, there's policy that needs to be determined and thought through and sort of tested. And we do that at the local, state, and federal level. So I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time in Hawaii. It's also the 50th state for me, so I've sort of checked something off of my list somehow by being here. And I'm going to follow your lead and finish with aloha. Hopefully I'm doing it right.
Thanks, Ben. Aloha. My name is Zoltan Milaskey. I'm president of Mana Energy. And we're a local Maui company, and we're a software company, and we specialize in monitoring and managing solar PV electric systems and other renewable energy systems here in the state of Hawaii. We started in Mahina, and we monitor about 500 facilities in the state, including all the state schools, all the state renewable energy systems, that belong to the Department of Education, along with a lot of private solar PV systems. And we've been able to take this local knowledge, this experience that we gained here in Hawaii, as Hawaii is really leading the nation when it comes to solar generation and the amount of solar we have on the grid at a given time compared to the size of the grid. And we've been able to leverage that, for our technology in other markets such as New Mexico, where we monitor and pulled in all of the utility scale solar farms that are for the utility company. We also are present in California, Colorado, and New Mexico, and New York as well. And we're just continuing on this mission to ensure that these sustainable technologies are sustained for the life of the system, and gathering this data and making sure that there's more solar and more renewable energy to help us reach our 2045 goals.
My name is Christina Borsum. I am representing the New Energy Nexus, which used to be called California Clean Energy Fund, so some of you may know us under that name. We're a not-for-profit organization. Our mission is to drive innovation and equity into the global clean energy economy. And part of why we're the New Energy Nexus is because we added equity and global into that mission over the last year and a half or so. We started off in 2004 with the settlement of the first PG&E bankruptcy. And we're a catalytic, super early stage fund-of-fund investor into clean energy technologies in California. And then over time worked out that it doesn't just take catalytic capital, although that's super important. But we also need to build an ecosystem. And in 2015 started building programs around our mission as well. So we now run for the California Energy Commission two significant grant programs and have also started to expand into Indonesia, Uganda, China, and Southeast Asia to accelerate clean energy entrepreneurs and connect them with capital. So if you recall the chart from before, we're squarely on the right-hand side of the spectrum as a not-for-profit. We're for Maximum Solutions, we're impact investors and accelerators, but our goal is to get enterprises to the left-hand side of the equation, to make them investable for the fiduciaries like Michael and others that don't have the impact first or can't put impact first. So that's us.
Thank you. Katrina?
So my name is Katrina Niehaus. I run the securitization group at Goldman Sachs. So what does that mean for all of the people here who don't speak finance? The same way that an individual goes out and borrows money to buy a car or a home or some other important thing in their life, companies need money as well as they think about needing a fleet of vehicles to rent out to people in the state of Hawaii. They want to develop solar projects. So I help companies think about how do we move the risk associated with investing in those sorts of projects to be as low as possible so that they can think about lowering their rate of return and passing through that cost to all of the people who partake in their profits. So kind of the other side of what you do, I think we hope that things will move from your market into my market and we'll be able to figure out how to make capital more available to companies.
And I was mentioned too that Katrina is actually from Maui.
Oh yes, I'm also from Maui, so I'm really excited to be home and be able to do this in a community that I care so much about.
Thank you very much. I actually want to start with a few questions for the panelists, and starting with you, Christina. Just talking about what we're doing in Nexus. I understand you have a new program called Cal Tested that basically takes energy technologies from prototype to pilot demonstration. What I wanted to ask you about is to talk a little bit, and maybe talk a little bit about how Hawaii and Maui in particular can help with the next phase, the implementation phase, creating a great implementation, that sort of thing.
Sure, and forgive me, I'm super excited about this program, so I'm going to rant and rave about the California Energy Commission. They have given us, through our grant process, $11 million to run a first of its kind program in the nation, which is connecting the entire UC, University of California system, as a testing and verification partner, and use $8.8 million to pay for those tests for clean energy entrepreneurs that now get access to world-class labs without any IP constraints, which is super important in sort of high-tech firms, that there aren't any IP disputes that can either make the companies really slow or ultimately cripple them. And the goal of these grants is because venture capital or other early stage capital is really hard to get for both what we call the first valley of death, which is sort of getting to a prototype of a clean energy technology, but then this is the second valley prototype, but in order to be in a very regulated industry, ready to deploy, you need to go through a lot of robust testing. And venture capital, which is really the only capital for the most part out there for that kind of company, they aren't willing to fund that. They want to fund that by the time you have completed your verification and testing and are ready for deployment with customers. So the Energy Commission is really filling a void and moving significant money plus significant resources out of the UC system to move us forward. The goal of that program is then to have essentially pilot-ready companies and products. And that's where we come in addition to administering this, but we also meant to connect all these clean energy entrepreneurs with their next and first customer. And that's where I think the community like Maui could play a role and actually just tap into our program as we run the connect you to your first customer. If you can define what you need and sort of, we think we're going to accelerate between 50 and 70 companies over the course of 3 years in that. There should be a lot of technologies there that are feasible and viable for an island grid that you're looking at. So, and from our perspective, the more the merrier in terms of first customers. So we're going to have the UC system in itself that has a 100% renewable mandate as a customer. And there are some other large purchasing groups. But the key for these technologies to be ultimately deployed rapidly are big and willing customers that are engaging in that first transaction. So that could be one way to plug it.
I was going to mention something. I think that if I'm correct, the California Energy Commission, the chair, if they actually funded the California Energy Commission.
Yeah, so this is, there's actually a charge on every California electric ratepayer bill. It's called the EPIC charge, Electric Program Investment Charge. That pool of money gets administered by the California Public Utility Commission, and the biggest chunk of that goes to the CEC, the California Energy Commission. And David Hodges, the commissioner, didn't give us the money. We had to go through a very competitive process on the grant. But he's certainly a champion for integrating renewables in California and trying to identify resources to get the state to 100% sooner rather than later.
And I was going to mention something about David Hodges because when we had a gubernatorial election quite a number of years ago when Mazie Urbana was running for governor against the woman who became our first Republican governor in Washington. But David Hodges actually wrote an op-ed about solar bonds back then that basically led to what became the first environmental debate in Hawaii's history, the gubernatorial debate. So David had a role in that. He didn't back then, he was making trouble. And I wanted to go to, thank you very much. Actually, Ben, if you could actually talk just a little bit more about Drive Electric Orlando and kind of how you see, you and I have been talking a little bit about this and we've talked about this on the phone, but just how you can see maybe Hawaii and Maui in particular, how we can sort of play a role in that, learn from lessons that you guys learned, and that sort of thing.
We made all the mistakes, so you don't have to do that anymore. So we create Drive Electric Orlando, and I'll just give you the quick version. We decided to do this as a rental car program with the expectation that one of the key factors around driving adoption for plug-in electric vehicles is that you got to get people behind the wheel. Sometimes we crudely refer to that as just butts and seats. Because for the most part, people who drive one are much more likely to buy one because the driving experience is far superior to an internal combustion engine car.
Yay!
And it also solves all kinds of problems that we've been discussing today in the long term. So we went to Orlando, and a big part of it is because just the way the tourism industry is set up there. There aren't a lot of public transportation options, and so everybody rents cars. It's actually one of the largest rental markets in the country. Additionally, all the distances that people travel are actually pretty short. So they're somewhere around 27 to 35 miles because they're just going to the theme parks and a few other places. And it was this sort of recognition that if we found a fleet, a rental car company that we could work with, we could have a relatively small fleet of vehicles that might have a significant impact on driving adoption. We also learned a lot about this though, and there's a lot about this that we were wrong about, not surprisingly. I think sometimes we have these, especially NGOs, we kind of get into this space of we're going to go solve this big problem, but we don't really understand business models. And I now know way more about the rental car industry than I ever wanted to. things like they have to have 85% utilization rate on their vehicles, otherwise they aren't getting the sort of in turn or money coming in. The idea that they have this global distribution system that then is connected to all these other things like kayak and all this stuff, and that's how then they manage their inventory. And you probably notice this when you rent a car, most of the time you're not actually paying for it at the time you rent it, most of the time you're just reserving it. And so there's also this other issue around these games they have to play with this global distribution system model that is something I never wanted to learn about. And then also the show rate for reservations, and then how does that affect the utilization rate? And then there's a bunch of other stuff, right? Like they really are like the biggest used car salespeople like in the world, right? So they actually buy a huge volume of vehicles, they drive them for 3 or 5 years, or whatever their model is, depending on the company, sometimes it's much longer than 5 years. And then they sell those cars, right? So they have this whole game that they really have understood and really learned how to do effectively, which is at what level do they buy the car, what price, use that for that duration, and then sell it. And that's a big part of how they then also make money. The challenge with EVs is they're so new to the market that it's really hard to understand and define what the residual value of an EV is. In fact, if you want to buy an EV, a used EV is an amazing deal right now because they actually are depreciating pretty rapidly. Part of that's the technology is getting so much better, right? So if you bought first time lease, it might have been an 80-mile range vehicle. Now you can get one that's 150 miles. It's kind of like the idea of buying the first iPhone, and then now you have the iPhone 11. They are radically different pieces of hardware or whatever. There's also just the other, and this is one of those things we need a panel just for me to talk about this whole thing. It's way complicated and interesting. But I can't do that. So I'll just finish by saying I do think there's still, we learned about also the idea of how do you engage with consumers, and I think in some ways we were too early for the program. The vehicles that were available didn't go far enough and created too much consumer anxiety. People call that range anxiety. I like to say range uncertainty. But they also, it's the idea that just recognizing that consumers, when they're coming, they're traveling, they're going on vacation, they're already freaking out and stressed out about all the other things that they need to go right. And then you're adding in this additional complex thing, whereas how do I find a charging station? What's a charging station? How do I pay for this thing? What do you mean it only goes this many miles? Like all this stuff that happens. And so you recognize you have to solve that side of the coin also. However, all those challenges, I will say, I still think that the model is there. Rental car fleets represent one of the largest fleets that we have in the United States. So if we can turn the key on plugging it in and pulling out the sort of gas station, it can radically change the way that we are sort of, fuel monopolized or oil monopolizes our transportation sector, and also really drive the consumer market. So I think Maui has a great opportunity. We just got to solve a few little challenges.
Yeah, makes sense. And we do have this panel tomorrow that's going to be talking about electrification, transportation, sort of looking at more from then. And I did want to say we're also going to get into the emotional talk about if we have some time that was mentioned in the previous panel. But I did want to actually ask Katrina about this, since Ben was discussing all the different issues of financing and everything with electric vehicles, and we're talking about electric vehicles particularly because Maui Electric actually wants to see more electric vehicles to actually pick up a lot of the renewable energy they're producing. We do see we can actually be a model here, but one of the most important things is to figure out how to work that whole financing piece, and that's also an important thing that we know here from this whole conference. You have to figure out the financing. The good idea is you have to have someone like Katrina, who fortunately for us actually comes from Maui, so knows about Maui. Can you talk a little bit, Katrina?
Yeah, so I think, Ben, you guys were just in some cases a little bit ahead of your time. When we talk about financing, it is all about what is the risk of the investment and how much money can I make off of that investment relative to the risk. So if the risk is higher, I want to earn a higher interest rate or a higher rate of return to compensate myself for the fact that I could have some loss or there could be some write-offs in my investment. And so I think the point you made about electric vehicles and financing those within rental fleets was really interesting. 5 years ago, most of the lenders to the rental car companies wouldn't allow electric vehicles into the facilities that or the loans that they made to the rental car companies to be able to buy their cars. And it was because of that exact point. The lenders to the rental car companies said, well, if the rental car company goes bankrupt and I need to take the vehicles back and sell them in order to be compensated for the money I lent to the company, I don't know how much an electric vehicle is actually worth. We've had more history now, and so I think you're starting to see that evolve. And as the financing aspect of it evolves, as people get more comfortable with what that risk component is, lenders like Goldman, like insurance companies, like pension funds are willing to make investments at lower rates of return because the risk and the risk of the unknown isn't as big as they originally thought it was. And so with a lot of renewable projects, whether it be solar panels or wind farms or battery technology or rental cars, some of it is time is in our favor. So as time passes, as we better understand technology, as we better understand what risks are, we're able to provide capital at a lower cost, which makes electric vehicles cheaper to the rental car companies to own. It makes solar cheaper for the average homeowner who wants to put it on their roof. And so I think the passage of time is really in our favor. I think you're also starting to see a lot of the big companies come out and realize what opportunities there are in renewable investing. Goldman came out last week and announced that we're going to invest $750 billion over the next 10 years in a variety of renewable and socially just causes. And I think a lot of that isn't because Goldman is always wanting to do the right thing. It's because we do want to do that, but it's because we see that there's opportunities. And you may say, oh, well, that's Goldman making money, but someone has to take that first step and bring capital to the projects so that we can make them accessible to everyone, so that Hertz can have electric vehicles on Maui, so that individuals can put solar panels on their roofs and do it in an efficient manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before I want to go and ask Zoltan and Mahina a question, but I actually want to just go back to this issue of Maui serving as a catalyst. And I think in the previous panel, Eva was saying, when people ask her what is it like to invest in Hawaii, and she was saying one of the things from the utility point of view, which of course we need to understand and that people that Maui understand, is that we do have these isolated grids. And let's go here. So one thing I wanted to just talk about here really quickly is, obviously this is a map of 3 major islands in Maui County. But one of the things that's actually a benefit to Hawaii in terms of actually testing new technologies is the fact that we actually have these isolated grids. So we have, we just talked about electricity, so we have electrical grids are isolated, we have transportation systems that are isolated, and we have telecommunication systems that are isolated. So what that basically means is you can actually test new technologies here less expensive than you can somewhere else. And if we're talking electric vehicles partially because I think there's a great opportunity here for that. The other reason for that is that there's let's take the city of Seattle, for example, which owns their utility. They would, city of Seattle, pretty liberal city, lots of electric vehicles. They want to do a lot more. The question is, what's the charging technology? How can we actually do this? And as we test that, because there's all these suburbs of Seattle, the question is, where do you stop? So where do you stop putting infrastructure in? On an island, obviously, the stopping point is the Pacific Ocean. So there's opportunities we have to actually invest, going back to what Christina was saying, if people come into technologies, opportunities to actually test it here and invest here in a way that actually requires less capital from proving out the system and kind of testing implementation phase of new technologies. And I'll just go down, talk about one other thing that we have. One of the benefits that we have in Hawaii is we have a law called the Sustainable Business Corporation Law, which on the left there's the citation, Hawaii Pride Statutes 420D. And this is basically a B corporation law. So there's about 30 states now that have B corporations. And basically what B corporations are is it says for the board of directors, it basically says that that you have a duty not just to your shareholders, you have a duty to the community, to your employees, something like that. And in this law, in B corporation laws, you actually have to fulfill that duty. So you have to look at that sort of broader and perspective on that. The unique aspect that Hawaii actually has is we have Section 8 of most of our legislation actually follows sort of general B Corp law legislation. We have a special section that actually talks about intellectual property. And without going into all the details about it, basically what it says is if you put patents in this corporation, you have to use those patents to create and retain good jobs in the state of Hawaii and the United States, uphold fair labor standards, and I'll do a little to that. But basically that means, right to collective bargaining, no child labor, things like that, and also enhancing environmental protection nationally and internationally. And let's go here really quickly to this before we get back to our questions, is that Chief Judge Paul Michel, who's now retired, was the top patent judge in the country for quite a bit of time, for about 10 years. And this is, when the law passed in 2011, he actually wrote a white paper about it and updated it in June of last year. And basically, what he basically says in this white paper, and this is a lot of legal language, but basically he says, if you put patents in an Ingenuity Corporation, which is a sustainability corporation that actually adopts Section 8, if you put those patents in there, basically what he's saying is that because those patents are required to be used in public interest, you actually increase your chances of getting injunctive relief if something brings on you, which means your patent is more valuable. And when the law passed, actually CalPERS, the guy at that point was the chair of investment committee, CalPERS actually contacted the Hawaii legislature because they were just starting to do their ESG stuff, or just getting into it and thinking, this is a great way for us to increase the value of underlying assets at the same time that we actually are doing the right things we want to do. So going back to what we're talking about here is the opportunity to develop new technologies in Hawaii, do them in a way that actually creates intellectual property, and a way that we can actually do that to increase the value of intellectual property and also it has benefits to the community. So it's sort of, I hate to use the word win-win, but kind of is. So anyway, I want to go over that just real quick and then come back to the panel. One of the things that we want to be able to look at is if we are looking at kind of the ESG benefits or the implementation benefits, whether it be electric vehicle fleets, the things that do with energy, one thing that have to do is actually track it to make sure it's actually happening. And can you just talk briefly about that in terms of what your work is and how we can kind of track success and what's happening?
Sure. So, in Hawaii, we have about 1.2 gigawatts of solar power, and that's roughly enough to power 300,000 homes almost. And right now, renewable energy is about a little less than 15% of the state purchase. And one of the important aspects there is tracking, whether how we're doing in terms of reaching our targets of reaching a point of self-determination, of independence, and not relying on imported fuels, and having a local know-how and technology to be able to power our daily lives. And as part of our work, is to track how these systems are performing, track how these investments are going. And solar energy, became a viable technology here in Hawaii due to a number of things coinciding. One of them being at the policy level, driven, providing tax benefits to solar energy investments. The other part is a social requirement that people want to be energy independent. And the third part is that solar works, right? We've had solar panels in space since the 1960s, and they still work. Thereby, it makes it a much less risky asset. So when people talk about new technologies, I think it's important to consider the fact that that those technologies are going to work, that have been proven over time, and that's what we're continuing to do as we collect the data and make sure that these systems are online and working. And what we notice through our data collection is that those systems that are financed, right? They're financed through what we call a power purchase agreement over the course of their life. Those systems, if they go offline, they're fixed right away because there's a financial incentive to go fix those because that's how that asset is going to be paid back. Whereas what we see, if a solar system is funded through a grant, it's just put on a roof, and we work with systems that, for example, the state school system, they were funded by a third party. They were paid for by a third party. They sell that power to the schools. Those systems are working. And what you don't want to have is have, a department like the Department of Education where their focus should be on educating, not on maintaining PV systems, right? So it's a very convenient way to do that. Whereas we've seen systems that were financed through a grant, such as the Maui Nature Center back in Niihau Valley, that'll go offline a lot, right? Because there's no incentive to keep it online once it's been built. And what we're seeing right now, throughout the state schools is they're one of the largest electric customer in the state. And right now they're ahead of the state in terms of their renewable portfolio, and they're producing nearly 20% of their power from on-site solar. And it's really important that you know, that not just state, not just businesses, and not just governments, but all of these agencies and institutions really push and push the state and push the utility company to promote and to find what it means to basically deploy renewable energies.
Thanks, Zoltan. And I want to go back to Christina really quickly. In terms of what I mean, I'm excited about your program too, the Cal Test Pit. And I think, you know, deploying the resources of University of California system and everything, part of, now that I've sort of talked a little bit about our island systems and being sort of these isolated grids, is that something you could see, you know, when you go through your sort of prototype stage, well, actually first, I guess, you go through your stages of actually looking at being able to implement some of these new technologies where they can actually be in real world, sort of grid connected setting that can also be tracked by what Zoltan is talking about, so you can really get data back on how it's working.
Yes, and so our biggest role is always the connector. We're not touching wires and we're not designing
Right.
systems, but we believe that in that networking piece, some of it very structured and some of it by creating collisions or almost serendipitous collisions at the events that we hold, or sort of the targeted invites, right? I would want to get a list of the people I need to invite to my symposium in LA in the fall so that we can introduce those who know everything about what needs to be done on the Maui grid and what the needs are and what technologies you need and what bundle of technologies you need, can get introduced to just the right entrepreneurs in our program. And that's sort of the magic that we bring. We curate those conversations, but we're not part of the technical part of the conversation. But knowing that maybe I should invite Zoltan too to it so that he can moderate the conversation, that's sort of where a bit of our magic is. And we're trying to figure out that magic structurally, but also creating the opportunities for that to happen. Does that
Thank
make
you.
sense?
That makes sense. Thank you. And I actually want to go back to Katrina for a second. I know that I was mentioned she obviously works for Goldman Sachs. But one thing that I was just going to ask you to comment on really quick, and in my experience and working in a certain sort of investment deal, one of the advantages of actually having an organization like Goldman Sachs actually get involved in ESG and responsible investment is that when Goldman comes to the table, people know they do want to make money. So if you're trying to raise a fund, they're like, oh, Goldman wants to make money, so we'll listen to the ESG part. And I think that in terms of if we were to move forward on something kind of unique, like we're talking about electric vehicles or whatever, you know, that sort of validation thing and being able to figure out all the pieces, is that something that kind of, the fact that you guys are considered to be mainstream and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of my goals is to figure out how do we make capital available in a mainstream way. So how do we move from the high net worth individuals giving money to people so they can create that moonshot technology to making that mainstream so that all of the pension funds and insurance companies can deploy all of their money that they have into investing in those technologies and feel comfortable in it. And you can feel good that your pension fund is being invested in solar and renewable or electric vehicles as opposed to Amazon or, you know, whatever else it might be. The only way pension funds are going to deploy capital into that space is if they feel comfortable that the risk is manageable and that they understand it. So bringing in, you know, significant partners who have experience, who can help quantify risk for people, who can do things in an orderly fashion, you know, I think is the goal. You want to be able to finance technology that was considered high risk 10 years ago in the regular way markets today, so that you can move on and find what the next wave of improvements are going to be.
And if I may interject, that's sort of also part of what we do, and we call that building the capital stack. So we love people like Goldman because you bring really big numbers to the table. You will never be the first $50,000 into a company. You don't even look at that deal. But if we can mobilize, and that goes along the spectrum, so it's grant capital or philanthropic PRI, program-related investment capital, and just believe me, it's capital that wants to come back ultimately, but has a long time horizon and doesn't want interest. And sort of big picture or guarantees that were mentioned before, and if we can creatively amalgamate that capital with a neutral party that sort of oversees it so that everybody's interest is aligned, and then pull that together so that the high-risk technologies can already be in that overall solution platform, together with more established technologies that essentially would get financed out of that pool with less risk-tolerant capital. There's probably a need for that to sort of creatively create that bigger base of capital for that whole risk spectrum that you're going to have in your grid plan. There are going to be some established technologies and some more moonshot technologies in there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I actually wanted to, Mahina, sort of in with you, since you do wear a lot of hats, and I think I have your slide, so let me go see if I have it.
At the very end.
But we're actually, I think we're, how many, we have like 1 minute, or?
3 minutes.
Okay, 3 minutes.
Oh, good.
So Mahina, let's end with you, and I'm going to pull up your slide if I have it.
Sure, and I'll explain our slide in a little bit, because it might puzzle you. Shall I wait for your question, or do you want me to just
I just wanted you to actually
launch into my opinion?
Yes, launch into your opinion. And I think also because you are Maui Electric Community Affairs, that's your job, but also everybody in Maui knows that you're involved in a lot of other things. How to sort of bring this all together in terms of how do we actually benefit the community? We're talking about sort of, big dollars and everything and investing in things, but how do we make sure the community is impacted? And that we also move forward in our goals of getting 100% renewables and that sort of thing.
Sure. So this is a very historic and epic time for Hawaii in terms of energy. We have the most ambitious goal in the country, in the nation. We live on islands with separate grids in a culture that may not welcome undersea cables, or the costs can be prohibitive. So many other technologies or other things you want to bring to Hawaii. So how do you meld all of that? How do you bring it together? For us, even for our own company, for Hawaiian Electric, we're an investor-owned utility. So we're sandwiched between the regulatory restraints, the cost, the welfare of not just our shareholders, because they invested their own money in us, but the welfare of the communities we serve. As a company that's been in existence on Oahu over a century, on Maui 99 years, on our other islands just as long, we have a responsibility as well. We have generational families that work for our company. We have generational relationships with our community. So reaching 100% renewable with all the resources and a community that values different resources or types of resources, and we have a sense of community. Because as an island community, we're different in nature. We have no freeway that drops off workforce. We have no extensive education system that will allow for those type of growth in those fields, in those arenas. Maybe we look at new technology, but we are still emerging on the discussions about what do you do with all the solar panels when they're reached their end of life? Where do they go? What's the cost to recycle? How do we ship them off? Is that the same for Oahu as it is for Molokai? Is it different from Kauai, from Hawaii Island? Do we need to truck them from one end of Kona to Hilo to get to the harbor? What about those things? So for us, it's a conversation that's really exciting. It's so different. We're definitely going to learn not just as a company, of course, but as an industry together. It's too big not to figure out together. So I wrote a couple of notes because it's kind of a loaded question. Our community is dear for many of us, myself included. When we talk about ESG, one thing I'm not hearing clearly and openly is the responsibility not just to the E, the S, the G, but to respect. And I think we expect that to be in there, but it needs to be named. So there's this responsibility of respect. Do the people of Hawaii and Maui want the new technology, the new ways? How are those questions answered? Where's the process for all of this? That's going to be an important part of it. Is there a process that's inclusive? And when we talk about process, it's a very informed public nowadays. I don't have to tell you how we are together. But more importantly, we talk about feasibility. We talked about reliability, sustainability. We have to look forward but keep the lights on. So what about acceptability? For Maui, we turn away a lot of projects. We also accept a lot of projects, but we must look at acceptability. And I'm talking about Are there genuine and authentic relationship? Is it baked in from the get-go? Is it a deliberate, we heard about intentionality earlier. Is there a deliberate step involved? Are people coming here with just a short version of a story or a long version of a commitment or relationship? Are they understanding of our culture that we're not a transactional society here? We're actually very, very circular because we're going to see you again and again and again, and we probably know where you live too. We certainly know where you work. We can find you that way too. So we have to keep that in mind. We're not a one-way. We don't leave the island much sooner than when you were born and raised here or if you just moved here. And finally, I want to talk about perspectives and realities. Sometimes we think that our ideas are the best things since sliced bread. And then we realize, oh, shucks, they don't even eat bread. They're eating poi. You can't even slice poi. What does that look like? So perspectives and realities are very interesting. You have to come to the table together. As a utility, yes, we can bring expertise to the table, but we understand that the communities, our customers, consumers in general, independent power producers, they have their own things to offer. And so that combination, I think, is going to get us to the type of future we want. And finally, oh, did the picture come up? Yeah. Oh, okay, that's okay. We talked about how do you weave all of this together from the from the commerce side, from community and culture, and it's really about a hakule, I know, and if you don't know what a hakule is, I want you to look it up, but the hakule is important because it's made uniquely for a community, it's done intentionally, deliberately, and it's reflective of each community. So I really want to encourage that type of innovation. But I also want to make sure that we're clear, what do you see, and is it welcome in the community, and are you taking actual deliberate steps? Because from Molokai, I learned this. Why you keep coming here and asking us what we like to do, and then we tell you we like, and then you make something, you meaning everybody, right, not just me or us, and then you leave. And the next one comes in, and all of a sudden Molokai is a petri dish. And we learned that even as a local community. And that's a lesson I think we need to apply to every island, every community. We can experiment, we can be innovative, but we must be mindful.
Thank you, Mahina. And thank you, everybody.